Some people look away when a child is in trouble. Emily Carter never did. The restaurant smelled like burnt butter and expensive wine, the kind of place where people pretended not to see anything that made them uncomfortable, and Emily moved between tables with practiced quiet, balancing a tray in one hand while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely, back in her small apartment where her 5-year-old son was probably already asleep without her, again, because rent didn't care if she was tired. The dinner rush pressed in, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, until one sound cut through everything, sharp and wrong, a child's voice trembling, and Emily turned before she could stop herself, spotting a little boy near the VIP section, his small hand caught in a man's grip that was just a little too tight, his eyes wide in that silent way kids had when they were trying not to cry in public, and something in Emily's chest pulled hard, instinct overriding caution as she stepped closer, ignoring the manager's warning look, ignoring the fact that those tables meant money she couldn't afford to lose. "Sir," she said, steady even though her heart was racing, "he's just a kid," and the man turned, irritation flashing across his face, the kind of look that usually made people step back, but Emily didn't move, not this time, not when the boy's fingers tightened like he was holding on to the only safe thing in the room, and for a second, everything seemed to pause. Conversations fading just enough for the tension to settle in the air like a storm about to break, and then another presence shifted the balance entirely, subtle but undeniable, because across the room, seated in perfect stillness, Adrian Volkov watched. He didn't raise his voice, didn't stand, didn't need to, the quiet around him carried weight, the kind that made people lower their eyes without knowing why, and his gaze locked onto Emily with a sharp, measuring focus, not on the man, not on the situation, but on her, like he was trying to understand something that didn't fit into his world, and Emily felt it, that attention, heavy and unfamiliar, but she kept her voice firm. "Let him go," she said, softer now, more certain, and after a beat that felt longer than it should have, the man released the boy with a dismissive scoff, like it had never mattered, like none of it did, and the child stepped back quickly, eyes darting, until they met Emily's, and she offered the smallest nod she could, a silent promise that he was okay now, even if just for this moment, and then the world rushed back in all at once, the manager appearing at her side, anger barely contained, whispers spreading through the tables, and Emily knew before a single word was spoken what this would cost her, but when she glanced back one last time, the boy was already being guided away, safe, and that was enough, or it should have been, until she looked up again and found Adrian still watching, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting lightly against the table like he was making a decision no one else could hear, and for reasons she couldn't explain. Emily had the sudden, unshakable feeling that this moment wasn't over, that something had just begun, something she couldn't walk away from, no matter how badly she needed to. Emily did not wait for the manager to finish speaking because she already knew how this ended, the tight voice, the forced smile, the reminder that employees like her were replaceable, and she stood there with her hands still slightly trembling from the adrenaline, nodding once as if she understood, even though her mind had already moved past the words to something heavier, the image of that boy's face, the way he had looked at her like she had given him something no one else would, and when she stepped out through the back door 10 minutes later, the cool night air hit her like a reset button, sharp and quiet compared to the noise inside, but it did not bring relief, not really, because now there was only the sound of her own thoughts and the reality waiting for her on the other side of the parking lot, rent due in 5 days, a refrigerator that was almost empty, a son who depended on her for everything, and a job she had just lost without hesitation. She wrapped her thin jacket tighter around herself and started walking, each step measured, controlled, like if she kept moving she would not have to think too hard about what came next, but then she noticed it, the silence that did not belong to an ordinary night, the kind that felt intentional, and when the low hum of an engine broke through it, she turned her head slightly, just enough to see the black SUV parked near the edge of the lot, too clean, too still, like it had been waiting, and her steps slowed despite herself, instinct telling her to keep going while something else told her she was already seen, and the window lowered just a few inches, not enough to reveal everything, only enough for a voice to reach her, calm and precise, the same voice that had carried across the room without ever needing to rise. "Emily Carter," Adrian said, not asking, simply stating, and her body went still for a fraction of a second because she had never told him her name, had never even spoken to him directly, and yet he knew, of course he knew, because men like him always did, and she forced herself to turn fully now, meeting the darkness behind the glass with a steady gaze she did not entirely feel. "You should not be out here alone," he continued, as if he were discussing something ordinary, something obvious, and Emily let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I do not think you get to decide that," she replied, her voice softer than before but no less firm, and for a moment there was silence again, not empty this time, but measuring, as if he was recalibrating something about her, and then the door opened, smooth and deliberate, and Adrian stepped out, the streetlight catching just enough of his features to make him real, tall, composed, every movement controlled in a way that made everything around him feel slightly out of place, and he looked at her not with curiosity, not exactly, but with a kind of certainty that unsettled her more than anger would have. "You protected him," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something quieter, almost reflective. Most people would not have done that. And Emily held his gaze for a second before answering, because this part mattered. "Most people should," she said, and the words hung there between them, simple and undeniable, and Adrian's expression shifted just enough to show that he heard more in that sentence than what was spoken, and when he reached into his coat, Emily tensed slightly, not out of fear but readiness, until he pulled out nothing more than a small, clean card and held it toward her. "I do not offer things twice," he said, his voice returning to that steady authority, "but tonight is different. Take it," and Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her mind running through every reason to refuse, every warning she had ever learned about men who moved like this, spoke like this, knew too much without being told, and yet her fingers moved before she could stop them. Taking the card without fully committing to what it meant, and as soon as it touched her hand, her phone buzzed in her pocket, sharp against the quiet, and when she pulled it out, the screen lit up with a message from an unknown number, just one line, simple and impossible to ignore: "Your son is safer with me," and Emily's breath caught for the first time that night, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that whatever line she had just crossed, she was no longer standing on the same side of it as before. Emily read the message twice before her mind allowed it to settle, the words simple but heavy enough to shift the ground beneath her feet, and when she looked back up, Adrian had not moved, his gaze steady, almost patient, like he had already anticipated this exact moment, and for the first time since she had stepped outside, something sharper than exhaustion pushed through her chest, not fear, not yet, but a clear line of resistance. "You do not get to talk about my son," she said, her voice low but unwavering, and Adrian tilted his head slightly, not offended, not surprised, just acknowledging the boundary she had drawn as if it were part of a larger calculation. "I already am," he replied calmly, and the certainty in his tone made her grip tighten around the card still in her hand, because he was not guessing, he was stating a fact, and Emily felt the instinct to walk away rise fast and strong, to put distance between herself and everything this man represented, but her feet stayed where they were, anchored by something she could not ignore, the message, the way he had said her name, the feeling that whatever this was, it had started before she even realized it. "What do you want?" she asked finally, choosing directness over hesitation, and Adrian stepped a fraction closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to shift the air between them. "I want to make sure you understand the position you are in," he said, his voice even, controlled. "Tonight, you stepped into something that does not end when you walk out the door," and Emily let out a breath through her nose, frustration mixing with disbelief. "I stood up for a kid," she said, "that is all," and Adrian's expression changed just slightly, something almost like a shadow of approval crossing his features. "No," he said, softer now, "you stood in front of my son," and the words landed differently this time, not as information, but as confirmation, connecting everything in a way that made the night feel suddenly larger, more complicated than a single moment in a crowded restaurant. And Emily's mind replayed the scene in fragments, the boy, the silence, the way everyone had stepped back without knowing why, and she swallowed, steadying herself before she spoke again. "Then he is lucky someone was paying attention," she said, and Adrian watched her for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring something he did not say out loud, and when he spoke again, his tone shifted, not softer, but more deliberate. "You lost your job because of that," he said. "You will lose more if you pretend this ends here." And Emily almost laughed again, because what else was there to lose? But the thought stopped halfway, replaced by the image of her son sleeping in their small apartment, unaware of any of this, and she straightened slightly, grounding herself in that reality. "I handle my life," she said, and Adrian nodded once, as if he respected the statement even if he did not agree with it, and then he gestured lightly toward the card in her hand. "That is my number," he said, not a suggestion, not a favor, an option, and the distinction mattered, she could hear it in the way he said it, and Emily looked down at the card for a second, the clean lettering, the simplicity of something that clearly held more weight than it appeared, and when she looked back up, Adrian was already stepping back toward the SUV, the conversation ending on his terms without needing to say so, and just before he opened the door, he paused, turning his head slightly. "You did the right thing," he said, not as praise, but as a statement that carried consequence. "Now you have to decide what that costs," and then he was gone, the door closing with a quiet finality as the vehicle pulled away into the night, leaving Emily standing alone again, except she did not feel alone anymore, not really, because the silence felt different now, watched, connected, and as she slipped the card into her pocket. Her phone buzzed once more, another message from the same unknown number, this time shorter, sharper. "We will talk soon," and Emily stood there for a long second before finally turning toward the street, knowing without fully understanding why that whatever came next was already moving toward her, whether she chose it or not. Emily did not remember the walk home, only the sound of her own footsteps echoing too loudly in her ears and the way her fingers kept brushing against the card in her pocket as if it might disappear if she did not check, and when she finally reached her apartment building, the familiar flickering hallway light greeted her like nothing had changed, like the night had not shifted something fundamental in her life. But the moment she unlocked the door and stepped inside, reality grounded her again. The quiet hum of the small space, the faint scent of laundry detergent, and the soft glow of a nightlight in the corner where her son slept on the couch, curled up under a blanket that was slightly too small for him now, and Emily paused there, watching him for a long second, letting her breathing slow, because this was what mattered, this was always what mattered, and she moved carefully, setting her bag down without making a sound, brushing a hand gently over his hair, reassuring herself that he was safe, that nothing had changed here, at least not yet, and for a moment, she almost convinced herself that the night outside had been an isolated moment, something strange but temporary, something she could ignore if she tried hard enough, but then her phone lit up again on the table, silent but insistent, and the screen displayed no name, just another message waiting for her, and Emily hesitated before picking it up, as if delaying it could somehow change what it said, but when she finally looked, the words were already there, simple, direct. "Did you get home safely?" And she stared at the screen, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them comfortable, because that question was not casual, it was not concern, it was awareness, and she glanced toward the window without thinking, half expecting to see something out there, someone watching, but the street below was quiet, ordinary, and that somehow made it worse, because it meant she would not see him even if he was there, and she set the phone down slowly, exhaling through her nose as she tried to regain control of the situation, because this was still her life, her space, her choices, and she refused to let that slip away without a fight. But the problem was not just him, it was everything he represented, the way he moved, the way he knew things he should not know, the way he had turned one small act into something larger without asking her permission, and Emily leaned against the counter for a second, closing her eyes briefly, letting the exhaustion catch up to her, because she had been strong all night, but strength had a cost, and she could feel it now in the weight pressing down on her shoulders, in the quiet fear that she refused to name, and when she opened her eyes again, her son shifted slightly in his sleep, murmuring something soft and indistinct, and that was enough to pull her back, to remind her that hesitation was not an option, that whatever this situation was, she needed clarity, not distance, and she picked up the phone again, her thumb hovering over the screen for a second before she typed, simple, controlled, "We need to talk," and the response came almost immediately, like he had been waiting for it, "tomorrow," and Emily's jaw tightened slightly, because even now he was setting the terms, but she did not argue, not yet, because she needed information more than she needed control in this moment, and she set the phone down again, quieter this time, more deliberate, and walked over to the couch, sitting beside her son and pulling the blanket up a little higher around him, her hand resting lightly on his back as if anchoring herself to something real, something that could not be taken or negotiated, and in the silence that followed, the apartment felt smaller than usual, not because anything had changed physically, but because the world outside it had expanded in a way she could not ignore anymore, and as Emily leaned back against the worn fabric, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it, one thought settled in with a clarity that made it impossible to deny: tomorrow was not just a conversation, it was a line she could not step back from once she crossed it. Emily barely slept, not because the apartment was uncomfortable or the night was loud, but because her mind refused to slow down, replaying every word, every look, every message until the quiet hours before dawn felt heavier than the entire day before, and when morning finally arrived, it did not bring clarity, only a sharper version of the same reality. Sunlight cutting through the thin curtains and landing across the small living room where her son now sat cross-legged on the floor, focused on a puzzle he had almost completed, his quiet concentration grounding her more than anything else could, and Emily watched him for a moment from the kitchen, coffee untouched in her hand, because this was the reason she could not afford mistakes, not with him, not with anything, and when he looked up and smiled at her like everything was normal, like nothing had shifted overnight, she forced herself to return it, steady, warm. "Practiced, did you sleep okay?" she asked, keeping her voice light. And he nodded, already turning back to his puzzle, unaware of the storm just outside their small world, and that innocence made her chest tighten in a way she could not ignore, because it was exactly what she had been protecting the night before, not just that boy in the restaurant, but this fragile sense of safety that children deserved without question, and Emily set her cup down. Decision settling in place without needing to be spoken out loud, she was going to that meeting, not because she trusted Adrian, but because she needed to understand him, needed to know how far this reached and what it meant for her son, and when her phone vibrated on the counter, she did not hesitate this time, picking it up immediately, the message already waiting: "Car will arrive in 15 minutes, and Emily let out a slow breath, because of course it would not be a suggestion, it would be a schedule, something already arranged before she agreed to it, and she glanced at the clock, then back at her son, calculating quickly, adjusting silently. "Hey," she said, stepping closer, crouching down so she was at his level, "Mrs. Dawson is going to watch you for a little while today, okay?" And he looked up again, curious but not worried, because this was not new, neighbors helping, small arrangements that made their life work, and he nodded again, trusting her completely, and that trust settled heavily in her chest as she stood, grabbing her jacket and checking her reflection briefly in the small mirror by the door, not to impress anyone, but to remind herself who she was before she stepped into something unfamiliar, something controlled by someone else, and when the knock came exactly 15 minutes later, precise and expected, Emily did not flinch. She simply walked to the door and opened it, finding not Adrian, but a man in a clean, dark suit, composed, respectful. "Miss Carter," he said, stepping aside slightly, "this way," and Emily nodded once, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that felt more final than it should have, and as she walked down the hallway, every step felt deliberate, chosen, even though she knew the path ahead was not entirely hers to control anymore, and when she stepped outside, the black SUV waited exactly where it had the night before, engine running, presence unmistakable, and for a second, just a second, Emily paused, the morning light reflecting off the windows in a way that made everything feel too clear, too real, and then she opened the door and got in, because hesitation would not change anything now, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, smooth and quiet, Emily looked straight ahead, her voice calm when she finally spoke, not to anyone in particular but to herself as much as the driver. "Let us see what he really wants," and somewhere ahead, in a place she had never been, Adrian Volkov was already waiting, not for her arrival, but for her decision. The city changed the moment the SUV crossed the river, not in a dramatic way, not with flashing signs or sudden noise, but in something quieter, more deliberate, the streets widening, the buildings taller, cleaner, like everything here had been chosen instead of inherited, and Emily sat in the back seat with her hands resting in her lap, still, controlled, her eyes tracking the passing scenery without really focusing on it, because her attention kept drifting back to the same question, not where they were going, but why he had chosen her, and the driver said nothing, did not look at her, did not offer any explanation, which somehow made the silence feel intentional rather than empty, like this entire ride was part of a structure she had stepped into without fully seeing, and when the vehicle finally slowed, turning through a set of iron gates that opened without hesitation, Emily felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that came with crossing into a place where rules were different, not written, but understood, and as the SUV moved up the long driveway, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires, the house ahead came into view, not just large, but composed, every line precise, every detail deliberate, like it had been built to communicate something without needing words, and Emily exhaled slowly, not in awe, but in recognition, because this was not just wealth, this was control, and control was something she understood in a very different way, and when the car came to a stop, the door opened before she could reach for it, the same man from before stepping aside again, respectful, measured, "Miss Carter," he said quietly, and Emily nodded once, stepping out onto the stone path, her shoes making a soft sound against the surface, grounding her in the moment, and she did not hesitate this time, she walked forward, because turning back was no longer an option she believed in, and the doors opened before she reached them, revealing a space that was as quiet as the outside, not empty, but contained, like every sound had a place and nothing existed without purpose, and Emily stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the softer light, taking in the high ceilings, the clean lines, the absence of clutter, and for a moment, she felt out of place, not because she did not belong, but because this world did not need to prove itself, it simply existed, and that was something she was not used to, and then she saw him, standing near the far end of the room, exactly where she expected him to be, as if the entire space had been arranged around that point. Adrian Volkov did not move immediately, did not rush to greet her, he simply watched her approach, his posture relaxed but intentional, like every part of him was aware of everything else in the room, and Emily slowed slightly as she got closer, not out of hesitation, but to meet his pace, to make it clear that she was not being led, she was choosing to walk into this. And when she stopped a few feet away, the silence between them settled. Again, familiar now, charged but not uncomfortable, and Adrian spoke first, his voice calm, steady. "You came," he said, not as a question, and Emily held his gaze without looking away. "I said I would," she replied, and something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptible, but enough to show that he had expected that answer, and then he gestured slightly toward the space beside him, not commanding, but directing. "Sit," he said, and Emily considered it for half a second before moving, taking the seat across from him instead, making her own choice clear without needing to say it out loud, and Adrian watched that too, the decision, the independence, the refusal to follow without thought, and when he sat down across from her, the distance between them felt measured, intentional, like a negotiation had already begun before either of them had spoken the terms, and Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, her voice calm but direct. "You said we would talk," she said. "So talk," and Adrian nodded once, not offended, not surprised, just acknowledging the line she had drawn, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if choosing his words with care, and when he finally did, his tone carried something different than before, something more precise. "You think this is about a job," he said. "It is not," and Emily felt the words settle in, heavier than she expected, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she had hoped it might be that simple, and Adrian continued, his gaze steady. "It is about what happens next," and for the first time since she had walked into the room, Emily felt the full weight of what that might mean. Emily did not look away even as his words settled between them, heavier than anything he had said before, because she understood something now that she had not fully grasped the night before. This was not an offer built on kindness, it was built on consequence, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating, just adjusting, giving herself space to think clearly. "Then explain it," she said, her voice steady, and Adrian watched her for a moment, as if confirming something internally before he continued. "Last night was not random," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. "The man you confronted was not just a customer, he was connected to people who do not appreciate interference," and Emily felt a flicker of irritation rise at the phrasing, because it made something simple sound complicated on purpose. "I did not interfere," she replied. "I stopped someone from treating a child like he did not matter," and Adrian nodded once, not disagreeing, but not adjusting his position either. "And that is exactly the problem," he said, and Emily frowned slightly, because that was not the answer. she expected, and he continued before she could respond. You made yourself visible, he said, not to me, I was already watching, but to others who noticed different things, and Emily let that sit for a second, her mind working through what he was implying, not danger in the obvious sense, but attention, the kind that lingered, the kind that followed, and she felt a quiet shift in her chest again, not fear, but awareness sharpening into something more precise. So this is what, she said. Slowly, you warning me, and Adrian's expression changed just slightly, something almost like approval crossing his features again. I am offering you control, he corrected, a way to stay ahead of what you have already stepped into, and Emily exhaled quietly, because there it was again, the structure, the framing, the way he presented everything as inevitable, and she leaned forward slightly this time, meeting him at his level. And in return, she said, what do you get? And Adrian did not hesitate. You, he said, simply, without emphasis, and the word hung there between them, not possessive in the way she expected, but not neutral either, and Emily's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in anger, but in focus, because that answer mattered more than anything else he had said so far. That is not specific enough, she replied, and Adrian allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch his expression, not amusement, but recognition. You are direct, he said, that is useful, and Emily did not respond to that, she just waited, because she knew now that silence was part of his process, and after a moment, he continued, you protected my son without knowing who he was, he said, that is not common, and it tells me something about how you make decisions, and Emily held his gaze, unflinching. It tells you I do not look the other way, she said, and Adrian nodded once. Exactly, he replied, and people like that are either broken by the world they live in or they change it, there is no middle ground, and Emily felt that land deeper than she expected, because it was not entirely wrong, and that irritated her more than anything else. I am not interested in changing your world, she said, her tone firm, and Adrian's expression did not shift, but something in his eyes sharpened. You already have, he said, quietly, and the certainty in his voice made it difficult to dismiss, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to settle the weight of what was being said, and then Emily sat back again, her posture steady, her voice calm. Say what you actually want, she said, no framing, no positioning, just say it, and Adrian studied her for a second longer, as if deciding whether she was ready for the answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more direct than before. I want you where I can see you, he said, where I can make sure nothing happens to you or your son that you cannot handle, and Emily's breath slowed, because this was the first time he had said it without layers, without strategy, and she understood now that this was not about a job, not about charity, not even entirely about protection. It was about proximity, control, and something else she could not fully name yet. And as she looked at him across the table, one thought became impossible to ignore: walking away would not make this disappear, it would only mean facing it alone. Emily held his gaze for a long moment after he finished speaking, not reacting immediately, because reacting too fast would mean giving him ground he had not earned, and she could feel the weight of his words settling into something more structured now, something clearer, and that made it easier to respond. You are not offering protection, she said finally, her voice calm but precise, you are offering control and calling it safety, and Adrian did not interrupt, did not correct her, which told her she was closer to the truth than he would admit out loud, and she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table again. Steady, grounded. I do not belong in your world, she continued, and I am not interested in being managed inside it, and for a second, the silence returned, not tense, but deliberate, as if he was allowing her to fully define her position before he answered, and when he did, his tone remained even, but there was a subtle shift in it, something firmer, less patient. You are already in it, he said. The only question is whether you stand at the edge of it or inside it where you can actually see what is coming, and Emily felt a flicker of frustration again, not because she did not understand him, but because she did, and that made it harder to dismiss, and she straightened slightly, her posture reflecting that shift. Then explain something to me, she said. If I walk out of here right now and decide none of this matters, what happens? And Adrian did not hesitate, which was what made the answer more real than anything else he had said. Then you go back to your life, he replied, and you hope that last night was small enough to be forgotten. And Emily held his gaze, waiting for more, because she knew there was more, and after a brief pause, he added, quieter now, but hope is not a strategy, and the words landed clean, without pressure, without threat, just fact, and Emily exhaled slowly, because she had built her entire life on making decisions without that kind of support, without that kind of certainty, and now he was offering something different. Not kindness, not comfort, but structure, and that was harder to reject than she wanted it to be, and she looked down for a second, just long enough to think clearly, to separate what she felt from what she knew, and when she looked back up, her expression had shifted slightly, not softer, but more focused, if I say. Yes, she said, this does not become my life, and Adrian's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in disagreement, but in consideration, and he nodded once, it becomes part of it, he replied, and Emily shook her head slightly, already rejecting the framing. No, she said, I set the terms, I decide what I do, where I go, how this works. You do not get to rewrite my life because I stepped in front of a situation that should not have existed in the first place, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something shifted more visibly in Adrian's expression, not anger, not resistance, but something closer to respect, the kind that came from recognizing strength where he had not expected it, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her again, but differently this time, not evaluating, not measuring, but adjusting. You think this is a negotiation, he said, and Emily met that directly. It is, she replied, whether you agree or not, and the silence that followed felt different from the others, less controlled, more open, like the structure of the conversation had changed in a way neither of them could fully predict, and after a moment, Adrian nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate, then start negotiating, he said, and Emily did not hesitate, because this was the moment that mattered, the one where everything shifted from reaction to decision. My son comes first, she said. Always, no exceptions, no conditions, and if I even think for a second that this puts him at risk, I walk away and you do not stop me, and Adrian held her gaze, listening, not interrupting, and Emily continued, her voice steady, unwavering. Second, I do not work for you, I do not belong to you, I do not answer to you, I make my own choices and you respect them, and the room felt quieter now, as if even the air was waiting for his response, and when Adrian finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, more measured. You are asking for a level of independence that does not exist in my world, he said, and Emily did not look away. Then maybe your world needs to adjust, she replied, and for a second, just a second, something almost like a smile touched his expression, not because he found it amusing, but because he recognized the challenge, and as he leaned forward again, his voice steady, controlled, he said, you are not afraid of me, and Emily held his gaze without hesitation. No, she said, I am not afraid of you, I am careful around you, and that answer seemed to land differently than anything else she had said, because Adrian did not respond immediately this time, and in that pause, Emily understood something important. She had not just stepped into his world, she had just forced it to shift. Even if only slightly, even if only for now. Adrian did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched longer than any before, not because he did not have a response, but because he was choosing one that mattered, and Emily stayed exactly where she was, steady, unmoving, because she understood now that every second of quiet was part of how he operated, how he tested, how he decided, and when he finally leaned back again, his gaze did not leave hers, but something in it had shifted, less distance, more intent, careful, he repeated. Almost to himself, as if weighing the words she had used, and then he nodded once, slower than before. Good, he said, and that single word carried more weight than agreement. It was acceptance of something he had not expected to find in her, and Emily felt that settle in, not as relief, but as confirmation that she had not misjudged the moment, and Adrian rested one hand lightly against the table, his fingers still, his posture composed. Then we proceed with clarity, he continued, you set conditions, I define boundaries, and we find the space where those do not conflict, and Emily listened without interrupting, because this was different now, not a warning, not an offer, but something structured, something closer to an arrangement than anything else, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift without agreeing to anything yet. Your son, Adrian said, and his tone changed again, quieter, more deliberate, is not part of this world, and he will not be treated as if he is. And Emily felt her shoulders relax just a fraction at that, not because she trusted him completely, but because he had said it plainly, without framing, and that mattered. He stays where he is, Adrian continued, his life remains unchanged unless you decide otherwise, and Emily held his gaze, searching for anything beneath the words, any sign of manipulation, but found none, only certainty, and she nodded once, slowly. Good, she said, her voice steady, and Adrian inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging that this was the most important part of the conversation for her, and then he continued, as for you, he said, you will not be obligated, you will not be assigned, and you will not be directed without your consent. And Emily's brow furrowed slightly at that, not because she disagreed, but because it sounded too precise, too intentional, like he had already considered her terms before she spoke them, and Adrian seemed to notice that, because he added, I do not invest in people who need to be controlled, and the statement landed differently than she expected, not as reassurance, but as a reflection of how he saw her, and Emily let out a slow breath, because that changed something she had not fully understood before. This was not about ownership, not in the way she had assumed. It was about alignment, about proximity to something he valued, and that made it more complicated, not less, and she leaned back slightly, her posture easing just enough to signal that she was processing, not resisting. So what does this actually look like, she asked, because structure meant nothing without detail, and Adrian answered without hesitation this time, it looks like access, he said, to resources you do not currently have, to information you would not normally see, and to protection that does not rely on reaction, and Emily absorbed that quietly, because each part of that sentence carried implications she could not ignore, and she looked down at her hands for a brief second before lifting her gaze again, sharper now, more focused, and in return, she said, you get to watch, and Adrian did not deny it, did not soften it. Yes, he replied, simply, and Emily let that settle, because it was honest, and honesty in a situation like this was more valuable than comfort, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer tense, but defined, shaped by the lines they had both drawn and adjusted, and then Emily nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she understood now that this was not something she could fully accept or reject in a single moment, it was something that would unfold whether she stepped into it or not, and as she stood slowly from her seat, Adrian's gaze followed her, not stopping her, not questioning her, just observing, and Emily met his eyes one last time before speaking, her voice calm, grounded. This is not a yes, she said, but it is not a no either, and Adrian inclined his head slightly, as if that answer made perfect sense to him. It is enough, he replied. And as Emily turned to leave, the weight of the conversation stayed with her. Not heavy, but present, like something that had already begun shaping her path, even if she had not fully stepped onto it yet. Emily did not look back as she walked out of the room, but she felt his presence follow her anyway, not physically, but in the way the conversation stayed with her, shaping every step as she moved through the quiet hallway and out into the open air again, and the difference hit her immediately, the outside world louder, less controlled, but somehow easier to understand, and when the SUV door opened for her once more, she paused just briefly before getting in, not out of hesitation, but to remind herself that this was still her choice, and as the car pulled away from the estate, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty, it was filled with everything she had just agreed to consider, every line she had drawn, every condition he had accepted without resistance, and that unsettled her more than if he had argued, because it meant he had expected this outcome, or something close to it. And Emily leaned her head back slightly against the seat, her eyes focused forward, her mind moving through the conversation piece by piece, testing it, looking for cracks, for anything she had missed, but the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that Adrian had not tried to convince her, he had simply laid out a structure and let her step into it on her own, and that made it harder to walk away from, not because she trusted him, but because she understood the logic behind it. And when the SUV slowed near her building, the familiar surroundings came back into view, grounding her again in the life she knew, the one she had built without help, without protection, without anyone watching over it. And as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the driver gave a small nod before the vehicle pulled away, leaving her alone again, at least on the surface, and Emily stood there for a second, looking up at her building, at the same cracked paint and flickering light that had never felt like a problem before, and now suddenly felt smaller, more fragile than it had that morning, and she pushed that thought aside quickly, because she refused to let perspective alone change how she valued what she had. And when she walked inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something cooking 2 doors down, ordinary, unchanged, and that steadiness gave her something to hold on to as she reached her apartment, unlocking the door and stepping in to find her son exactly where she had left him, now sitting at the small table with Mrs. Dawson nearby, talking softly about something she could not quite hear, and the moment he saw her, his face lit up, simple, immediate, and Emily felt the tension in her chest ease just slightly as she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, grounding herself in something real, something untouched by everything else, and after a few minutes, Mrs. Dawson gathered her things and left, offering a quiet smile that Emily returned automatically, and when the door closed again, the apartment felt smaller, quieter, but also more certain, and Emily sat down beside her son, listening to him talk about his day, about things that did not carry weight beyond the moment, and she let herself stay there for a while, present, focused, because this was the part of her life she refused to let shift, no matter what else changed. And later, after he had gone to bed and the apartment returned to silence, Emily stood by the window, looking out at the street below, her reflection faint in the glass, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card Adrian had given her, turning it over once between her fingers, not as a decision, but as a reminder, and her phone buzzed softly on the table behind her, the now familiar unknown number lighting up the screen again, and when she walked over and looked at it, the message was already there, simple, precise, "You handled that well," and Emily stared at the words for a second before typing back, her response just as controlled, just as deliberate, "I have not decided anything," and the reply came almost instantly, as if distance and time meant nothing at all, "You already did," and Emily's fingers stilled on the phone, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read it again, because that was the part she did not like, not the offer, not the structure, but the certainty, the assumption that her path had already shifted whether she admitted it or not, and as she set the phone down slowly, turning back toward the window, one thought settled in with quiet clarity: tomorrow would not wait for her to be ready, it would arrive already in motion, and the only question left was whether she would meet it on her terms or be pulled into it without them. Emily did not respond to the message that night, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood something now that she had not before. Responding too quickly meant reacting, and reacting meant giving up control she had just fought to establish, so she let the phone sit on the table, screen dimming back to black, and turned off the light instead, choosing silence over engagement, and yet even in the quiet, sleep did not come easily, because her mind kept returning to the same point, not what Adrian had offered, but how easily it had fit into the spaces of her life that were already strained, and that realization stayed with her long after the apartment fell still, settling into something she could not ignore by morning, and when the next day arrived, it did not bring anything dramatic, no sudden changes, no visible signs that anything had shifted, just the same routine, the same small kitchen, the same early light through the window, and Emily moved through it all with practiced efficiency, making breakfast, helping her son get ready, listening to him talk about something simple and important only to him, and she stayed present, fully present, because that was her anchor, that was what everything else had to align with, and when she walked him to the door and watched him leave with Mrs. Dawson again, she felt that same quiet tightening in her chest, not fear, but awareness, because now she knew that what she did outside of this apartment had weight beyond herself, and as she closed the door and turned back inside, the silence felt different, not empty, but expectant, and she reached for her phone without hesitation this time, opening the message thread again, reading his last words once more before typing slowly, deliberately, "If this is going to work, it happens my way," and she paused before sending it, not because she doubted the statement, but because she understood what it meant. This was not a response, it was a declaration, and when she finally pressed send, the reply came just as quickly as before, "Then show me what that looks like," and Emily exhaled quietly, because that was the shift, not him pulling her in, but him waiting for her to step forward, and she walked to the window again, looking out at the street below, at people moving through their day without knowing how easily things could change, and she realized something then, something simple but important. She was not being forced into this, she was choosing to engage with it, and that meant she could shape it, even if only partially, and her phone buzzed again, another message appearing beneath the last, Be ready in 1 hour, and Emily let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because of course he would move things forward without waiting for her to fully settle into the decision, and yet this time, it did not frustrate her the same way, because she had already set the terms, already made it clear where she stood, and now it was about seeing whether he would respect that in practice, not just in words, and she moved through the apartment with more focus now, not rushed, but intentional, changing into something simple and clean, tying her hair back, checking her reflection not for approval but for clarity, and when the hour passed and the knock came again, just as precise as before, Emily did not hesitate at all this time. She opened the door immediately, meeting the same quiet professionalism on the other side, and as she stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her, she felt something settle into place inside her, not fear, not uncertainty, but something steadier, something closer to resolve, because this was no longer about reacting to what had already happened, it was about deciding what happened next, and as she walked toward the waiting vehicle once more, her posture straight, her expression calm, one thought stayed clear in her mind: if Adrian believed she had already made her choice, then today she was going to show him exactly what that choice meant. The second drive felt different, not because the route had changed, but because Emily had, and she sat in the back of the SUV with her posture straight and her thoughts clear, no longer replaying what had already happened, but focusing on what she intended to do next. And when the gates opened again and the vehicle carried her into that same controlled space, she did not look around this time, she did not take in the scale or the silence, because she had already seen it, already understood what it represented, and now it was just a setting for the conversation she was about to lead, not follow, and when the car stopped and the door opened, she stepped out without pause, her pace steady as she moved toward the entrance, the doors opening as before, the same quiet precision greeting her, and Adrian was there again, exactly where he had been, as if nothing in his world shifted unless he allowed it to, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence familiar now, but different in weight, less about testing and more about recognition, and Emily did not wait for him to speak this time, she walked forward and stopped at the same distance as before, her voice calm, direct. "We are doing this differently today," she said, and Adrian's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, not resisting, not interrupting, simply allowing her to continue, and she did, because this was the point she had decided on before she ever stepped into the car, yesterday. "You explained your position," she said. "Today, I define mine," and Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the shift in control without needing to comment on it, and Emily continued, her words measured, each one intentional. "If I am stepping into any part of your world, it is because I choose to understand it, not because I am pulled into it," and Adrian watched her closely now, not evaluating, but listening in a way that suggested this mattered, and Emily held his gaze, unwavering. "That means transparency," she said, "not everything, not details you cannot share, but enough that I am not operating in the dark," and the request hung in the air, not unreasonable, but not simple either, and Adrian considered it for a moment before responding, his voice steady. "Information has weight," he said, "once you carry it, you cannot put it down," and Emily nodded once, already aware of that. "Then I decide what I am willing to carry," she replied, and that answer seemed to land with more impact than expected, because Adrian's posture shifted slightly, not defensive, but more engaged, and Emily continued, not giving the moment time to settle. "Second," she said, "I am not here to be protected from every problem, I am here to know which ones actually matter," and Adrian's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in disagreement, but in recognition, and Emily leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening just enough to emphasize the point. "You said I made myself visible," she said. "Then I need to understand what that visibility means, not in general, but specifically, what changed because of that moment," and the room felt quieter now, not because of tension, but because the conversation had shifted into something more precise, something that required clarity instead of control, and Adrian did not answer immediately, which told her this was the part that mattered most, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight than before, less measured, more direct. "It means someone noticed," he said, "and they will want to understand why you acted the way you did," and Emily held his gaze, absorbing that without reaction, because that was the kind of answer she needed, not softened, not framed, just real, and she nodded once, slowly. "Good," she said, that is where we start," and Adrian watched her for a second longer, and then something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, not in the room, but in him, because for the first time since she had met him, he did not lead the conversation forward, he followed her into it, and that was the moment. Emily understood something she had not fully realized before. She had not just entered his world, she had just begun to change how it responded to her. Adrian did not look away as she finished speaking, and for a moment the room held that same controlled silence, but it no longer felt like something he owned, it felt shared, shaped by both of them, and that shift was subtle but undeniable, and when he finally moved, it was not to reassert control, it was to meet her where she stood. "Then you start with truth," he said, his voice steady, and Emily watched him closely as he continued. "Someone in that room recognized what you did as a disruption, not because of the child, but because you did not hesitate," and Emily let that settle. Because it aligned with what she had already begun to understand, this was not about the action itself, it was about what it revealed, and Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "People who operate in controlled environments notice patterns, and you broke one," he said, and Emily nodded once, not reacting emotionally, just processing, because this was the kind of clarity she had asked for, and Adrian stepped closer this time, not intruding, but reducing the distance between them enough to make the next part land with precision. "That means they will look for you again," he said, and Emily held his gaze, steady, unflinching, because this was not a warning anymore, it was information, and information could be used, and she exhaled quietly, her posture unchanged. "Then I stop being someone they can read," she replied, and something in Adrian's expression shifted again, not surprise, but recognition, because that answer was not defensive, it was adaptive, and he nodded once, slower this time. "Exactly," he said, and for the first time, there was no distance in his tone, no calculation layered over it, just agreement, and Emily felt something settle into place inside her, not acceptance of him, but acceptance of the situation, the reality of what she had stepped into and what it required, and she turned slightly, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the space again, but differently now, not as something foreign, but as something she was learning to navigate, and when she looked back at him, her voice was quieter, but more certain. "Then this is not about protection," she said, "it is about awareness," and Adrian did not correct her, did not reframe it, he simply answered, "Yes," and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have added, and Emily nodded once, because that was the difference. Protection could be taken away, awareness stayed with her, and that meant she could control how she moved forward, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer a test, but a pause, a recognition of what had just been established between them, and then Adrian stepped back slightly, giving her space without breaking the connection. "You decide how far you go with this," he said, "but understand that once you see it clearly, you will not be able to ignore it again," and Emily met his gaze one last time, her expression calm, grounded, because she already knew that, she had known it. The moment she stepped between that man and the child, and she nodded, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, and then she turned and walked toward the door, her step steady, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, because this was no longer about leaving, it was about moving forward, and when she reached the threshold, she paused just briefly, not to look back, but to take a breath, to mark the moment in a way only she would understand. And then she stepped out into the light again, the world outside unchanged, but no longer simple, and as she walked toward the waiting vehicle, one thought stayed clear in her mind. She had not been pulled into something beyond her control, she had chosen to see it, and that choice meant everything that came next would be hers to face, not as someone protected, but as someone aware, and somewhere behind her, in a world built on control. Adrian did not call her back, did not stop her, because he understood something just as clearly, she would return. Not because he asked, but because now she knew exactly where she stood.